Three shots in broad daylight. Colombia never recovers. Jorge Eliécer Gaitán collapses on Bogotá's main street. Before anyone can ask why, the only suspect is dragged into a drugstore and beaten to death. The answer dies in minutes. What follows is not a riot, it's a rupture. Some say it was a lone gunman. Others point to a thin man seen near the killer. Some argue the real crime came after the rush to call the chaos foreign subversion while the city burned. That day didn't just kill a man, it taught Colombia when truth dies with the suspect, rumor becomes history. Unfinished grief shapes a nation for generations. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Loda. Here we move from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, always with an undercurrent of intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Each week we bring new revelations ready for your next campfire debate. Three shots. Carrera Séptima is Bogotá's spine, full of office workers, vendors, footsteps, and noonlight. Gaitán falls like the future itself, hitting pavement. Later, people argue angles, distances, seconds before the scream, whether the first hands were trembling or furious. But nobody argues the result. Colombia's most magnetic political voice is carried to a clinic, bleeding through a city that still thinks it's having a normal afternoon. The line spreads faster than any ambulance, faster than truth. They killed Gaitán, not he was shot, not there was an attacker, not a clean sentence you can investigate, just a wound with a subject already plural. They. That word, they, is the match. Within minutes, a country that has been holding its breath for years exhales a breath of fire. Here's what people outside Colombia sometimes miss. April 9th, 1948, isn't just an assassination. It's a hinge, an hour when history pivots so sharply you can feel the crack. Decades later, people still run their fingers over that splintered edge, asking what broke. This isn't a conspiracy tale or a comfort story. It's a Latin American mystery, where the most honest thing is to hold three questions at once and admit they all still burn. This story has three mysteries. Here's what you're staying for. First, who fired the shots? And does the lone gunman theory truly hold up, or is it just convenient? Second, who was near the gunman? Those shadows, those witnesses, and especially the thin, wild-eyed man always described, never identified. Third, who shaped the narrative as Bogotá burned? Sometimes the real weapon isn't a revolver, it's the label stamped on chaos before the smoke clears. I'm going to say something openly, the way I would at a table in Bogotá with people I trust. April 9th lives in the city like a scar under makeup. Taxi drivers, grandparents, professors, and the guy who sells Tinto all become historians the moment you mention Gaitán. Rumors and alternative interpretations have always existed within Bogotá. Some are political, some are intimate, some are ugly. Some are almost too human to be true. There are whispers about enemies he made as a lawyer, feuds of honor, jealousies, affairs, and crimes of passion. I'm not here to sanitize those whispers into silence. I'm here to place them where they belong, so we keep our credibility without killing the tension that history itself refuses to resolve. Before Gaitán became a symbol, he was something rare, a man who understood how violence works in Colombia. He saw not just how bullets move, but how society calls murder justice and vengeance duty. To understand April 9th, we need to go back not to the gunshot, but to the courtroom in Cali, 1933. Colombia's violence had an older language, honor, humiliation, and a belief that blood could redeem. The night of August 22nd, 1933 was no ordinary night in Cali. Around 7:15 in the evening, on 12th Street, one of the city's central arteries, the well-known journalist and liberal politician Jorge Zawadsky shot and killed the young physician Arturo Mejia Marulanda. At first glance, it sounds like a scandal. On its surface, it was, but what matters is the engine underneath. This was not political violence in the narrow sense. It was a homicide born inside the private kingdom of Colombian society. Family, reputation, public masculine honor, and ruthless gossip could turn a home into a courtroom. All of these were treated as sacred. The story's core is intimate, brutal. A doctor enters a household through illness, care, trust, then crosses a line with someone's wife. What follows is betrayal, then ridicule. In Colombia, ridicule is not harmless. People watch, they whisper, the press chews, the city laughs. Where masculinity is fragile glass, laughter is violence, and private shame becomes public identity. Zawadsky tries to keep the family together, tries to forgive, but society keeps reopening the wound for sport. After months, then years of that slow torture, the era's moral code delivers its cold conclusion. Zawadzki decides that killing Arturo Mejia is the only way to cleanse the family honor, not the only way in reality, not the only way in any humane world, but the only way inside the code his time has etched into men's bones. This is why the case became famous. Colombia watches it not simply as a murder trial, but as a referendum on what counts as understandable. Now comes Gaitán. Here is why I bring you back to Cali. This is the turning point. His role shapes what comes next. The Zawadzki trial was not only about whether a man killed another man, but also about whether Colombian society would admit what it was doing when it excused violence in the name of reputation. The case became a legal spectacle, packed with curiosity, class, moral theater, and public opinion. As often happens, the public began leaning toward forgiveness before any judge spoke. Into that arena steps Jorge Eliécer Gaitán, not as a martyr, not as a prophet, but as a defense attorney with rare insight. He knew Colombia's violence lives in stories before it lives in bullets. He didn't build his defense on the oldest slogan, "I killed for honor." The crowd was tempted by that storyline. Instead, he did something more modern and more dangerous. He shifted the argument to the mind. He brought psychiatric language into a culture long shaped by revenge and duty. He asked the court to consider rage, shock, and unbearable distress. He described how a social wound can overwhelm a person until reason collapses. Here's what matters for our story. It isn't folklore. It's structure. At the time, the law allowed honor to reduce punishment and treated sudden rage differently from cold-blooded intent. Gaitán saw how society forgives killing if justified by the right story, how the press can shape verdicts, and how thin the wall is between private violence and public life in Colombia. So when Bogotá later whispers that Gaitán's assassination might not have been only political, that it could have been tangled with jealousy or personal vengeance, that rumor doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a culture where politics and passion are not separate rooms. Sometimes they are the same house with different doors. I'm not saying that version is true. I'm saying it is culturally legible, which is why it survives, especially when the country is denied a clean motive. Zoom out. Because Colombia, entering the 1940s, is already an anxious country, it is full of dry wood stacked everywhere. The liberal and conservative parties aren't just electoral machines, they're identities, families, and neighborhoods. In the countryside, partisan hatred becomes intimate. Your last name, your church, and even the color of your tie can decide whether you live. The violence, later called la violencia, did not spring up overnight. It accumulates like pressure in a sealed room. Gaitán's gift and curse was naming that pressure. He spoke of two Colombias, the political country where decisions were made over dinner and the poor were statistics, with poverty, unfairness, and the knowledge that the state arrived only as a policeman, a tax, or a promise never kept. When he spoke, crowds didn't just listen, they recognized themselves. That recognition is dangerous. Once people see themselves as a force, they stop accepting crumbs as destiny. Gaitán didn't become Gaitán only through speeches. He became him through wounds. In the late 1920s, Colombia carried one of its most infamous open wounds, the massacre of banana workers on the Caribbean coast, a collision between labor, state power, and foreign economic interests that became a national trauma and a symbol of how cheaply poor lives could be spent when money and order demanded it. Gaitán's role in bringing attention to that atrocity became part of his legend, the young orator standing in the national arena, pointing at blood in the sand, and refusing to let it be buried under official phrasing. He learned early that in Colombia, the fight is not only over what happened, but over what language will be allowed to describe it. By 1946, the political structure was cracking. The conservatives returned to power, helped by a liberal split, and in a country like Colombia, division is not a small inconvenience, it is an invitation. The countryside becomes a laboratory of fear. Local bosses test how far they can go. Police forces, partisan bands, and clandestine groups operate with growing confidence. This is the atmosphere that makes Bogotá feel unstable even before the Bogotazo, like a city smiling as it hears distant thunder. Inside conservatism, there is a name that becomes an ideological knife: Laureano Gómez. Not a background character, not a distant columnist throwing stones from a safe hill, but a man who helped rewrite the emotional rules of politics until rivalry started sounding like sin and disagreement started sounding like treason. He had a gift for turning partisan conflict into a moral war, and a platform that could make that war feel like common sense. His newspaper, El Siglo, was not just ink and headlines, it was a weapon, a drumbeat that could hammer the same framing into a reflex. The enemy is not simply wrong, the enemy is rotten. And when politics starts sounding like moral contamination, violence starts sounding like purification. By the late 1940s, that reflex mattered because Colombia was already vibrating with accusations so absolute they left no space for compromise. In that climate, politics stopped being a contest for votes and started becoming a contest for survival. Then comes February 7th, 1948. Bogotá witnesses the March of Silence. Tens of thousands gather not with chance but with disciplined quiet. It isn't chaos, it's control, it's a warning. This movement can mobilize and can also restrain itself. Gaitán stands before that mass and asks the president for peace and pity for the homeland. In another Colombia, that might have been the beginning of reconciliation. In Colombia, it is a sign that pressure is reaching its limit. Now add the final layer. April 1948 is not just Colombian, it is hemispheric. Bogotá is hosting the 9th International Conference of American States, the meeting that will give birth to what becomes the Organization of American States. The city is full of diplomats, journalists, security personnel, and above all, interpreters. Hanging over everything is the newborn mood of the Cold War, the fear that unrest anywhere is proof of a global enemy everywhere. This matters because when the city explodes, it explodes under international eyes, and those eyes arrive with assumptions already loaded. And in that same Bogotá, in that same week, is a young Cuban student activist, Fidel Castro. Not yet a symbol, not yet a leader, just a young man moving through a city that feels on edge. His presence is documented. What he did in the hours around April 9th, who he met, and how much weight later memories gave to that moment are disputed. But the convergence itself is real, and it matters because history often feels uncanny at its turning points. By early April, Bogotá is a stage with too many actors and no script, a populist titan, a divided elite, a country already tasting blood, an international conference obsessed with order, and young radicals dreaming of change. And then comes April 9th. Early afternoon, Gaitán steps out of his law office on Carrera Séptima with associates heading to lunch. Ordinary, mundane, the kind of moment that makes history feel cruel because it chooses the most normal seconds to turn into legend. Then the shots, sharp, wrong, unmistakable. He collapses. He is rushed to the Clínica Central. He dies shortly after, while the street tries to understand whether it is watching a tragedy or the opening of something worse. Now the city changes its face, because grief doesn't move alone in politics. Grief brings blame, and blame looks for a body. The name that becomes that body is Juan Roa Sierra. He is seized, pulled into a nearby drugstore for protection, and locked behind glass while the street swells outside. And here is where Colombia's tragedy becomes permanent. Before any courtroom can test his story, before investigators can separate what he did from what others might have arranged, the crowd breaks in, they drag him out, they beat him to death, and with that, Colombia loses the only living thread that could have led to a motive spoken under oath. In some accounts, in the final seconds when a policeman begs him to say who ordered him, Roa answers in a way that lands like smoke instead of clarity, that there are powerful things he cannot tell. Whether that line is remembered exactly or distorted by the panic of the moment, the meaning is the same. The suspect dies and the country is denied. Why? This is why the drugstore matters. It is the moment the case becomes a ghost. It is the instant the country is denied motive. And once a country is denied motive, it does what humans always do in the dark. It builds meaning out of what's left. Rumor becomes explanation. Suspicion becomes structure. Every contradiction becomes a doorway. The Bogotazo is not a single action. It is a storm. Government buildings, police stations, conservative symbols, churches, and businesses are attacked. Some seek revenge. Some seek weapons. Some seek alcohol. Some seek to strike at authority itself. Radios are seized. Messages explode. The word "they" becomes 1,000 accusations. Smoke rises like a second skyline. The death toll becomes contested because records collapse when cities burn. What is not contested is the wound. Bogotá itself is broken open, and the violence does not stay politely contained. It spreads into a countryside already primed for vengeance. La violencia deepens. Families are displaced. Fear becomes routine. Once fear becomes routine, it no longer needs a mastermind. It only needs momentum. Now, to balance this story, you have to see something uncomfortable, because April 9th is not a morality play with one villain and one innocent crowd. It's a nation splitting in real time, and the split runs through every side. On April 9th, the popular fury that tears Bogotá open is largely the fury of Gaitán's people. The riots are not a neat party operation. but they are not politically neutral either. This is a mass response to a political assassination, and it moves with the emotional logic of a movement that has just lost its voice. Historians have pointed out that if that uprising had been unified and organized, it might have toppled the government, but it wasn't. The street had fire. It did not have a single hand on the wheel. At the same time, almost like a second film playing in another room, the liberal leadership is negotiating. That contrast is cruel, but it is real. While parts of the city burn and scream for vengeance, liberal notables move through corridors of power, trying to force an orderly solution, trying to pull the crisis back into institutions before the country collapses. The president refuses to resign. A compromise emerges. In the popular imagination, this can feel like abandonment. The people burn, the leaders bargain. Serious history tends to treat the word betrayal as too simple, but it also admits the wound behind the accusation, because perceptions forged in smoke are rarely softened later by legal nuance. And then there is the third liberal force, the one that forms after Bogotá, in the provinces, in the countryside, where grief hardens into self-defense, and self-defense can become a lifelong war. In parts of Colombia, April 9th serves as a warning that institutions may not protect you. And when people stop believing protection is coming, they start building protection themselves. This is how the Bogotazo becomes more than Bogotá. This is how it pours into a countryside already tense and armed with memory. Now the third mystery takes shape, the battle to control the meaning of April 9th. Because Bogotá was not alone. Diplomats were present. The conference resumed under armed guard. International leaders began to name what they believed had happened. In that moment, Cold War language hardened. Unrest was framed as subversion. Intelligence was invoked as authority. Even when the proof was unclear, the label carried power. Some political actors and press narratives, especially on the conservative side, began to invoke U.S. intelligence as rhetorical authority, as if secret reports could settle what blood and chaos had made unstable, portraying the violence as part of an international communist plot. Liberal voices pushed back, questioning investigative failures, police actions, and the speed with which the case closed around a dead suspect. American officials, in their own reporting, sometimes noted that many of the sweeping claims circulating in public could not be verified. None of this tells us who killed Gaitán, but it tells us something else. The argument itself became a battlefield. Intelligence became a political prop. The mystery was not only what happened, but who got to sound certain while everyone else was still choking on smoke. And then there is the second shadow that refuses to leave. According to reports from the era, witnesses described a strange companion near Roa Sierra, a thin man with mad eyes, seen talking with him shortly before the shots. Later accounts would describe police searching for that figure, and international reporting would attach him to a particular suspect, even to strange stories about impersonation and mysticism. Leads appeared, arrests happened, examinations were discussed, and then the trail dissolved. The thin man became less a solved clue than a symbol of how close the truth might have been, and how easily it slipped away when the city chose lynching over law. Now return to the most uncomfortable lane of all, the one Bogotá never stops whispering about. The possibility of a crime of passion, jealousy, a personal enemy, an affair, something intimate enough to explode into public catastrophe. There is no definitive proof. There is no scholarly consensus that such a motive explains the April 9th events, but the rumor survives because it fits a society where honor and violence have long been intertwined, and because the suspect died before any court could separate the personal from the political. The rumor is not evidence. It is a symptom of a case that never reached closure. And what of the CIA, of foreign hands, of the darker security world that Latin America would later come to fear? Here the line must be held carefully. There is no proven evidence that the United States intelligence orchestrated Gaitán's assassination, but there is clear evidence that U.S. officials closely monitored the event, responded to it, and helped shape its interpretation within an emerging Cold War framework. Intelligence narratives circulated, labels hardened, hemispheric security logic expanded. And what you can say, without overreaching, is that the hemispheric anti-communist security imagination is being rehearsed here, on paper, in conferences, in declarations, in the instinct to treat popular unrest as an enemy operation, long before it would take the more infamous forms the continent later learned to dread. The assassination remains unresolved, but the consequences of its interpretation are not. This is why historians speak of April 9th as a turning point. Not because one bullet created every future tragedy, but because it marked the collapse of trust. Reform gave way to retaliation. Politics learned to speak with weapons, and from those ashes emerged decades of armed struggle, guerrillas, counterinsurgency, paramilitaries, and a society trained to live with unfinished grief. And if you want to understand that long chain without turning it into destiny, you hold it the way Colombians hold so many hard truths, as a trajectory, not a prophecy. April 9th does not create the FARC like a switch, but it helps ignite La Violencia, and La Violencia produces rural armed traditions, self-defense, persecution, retaliatory logic, and a long education in survival. In that furnace, you begin to see the shadows of later figures before they become symbols, peasants learning the geography of war because politics has failed to protect them. From April 9th comes a lesson that is not romantic, only cold. If politics leaves you orphaned, the mountains adopt you. And when people ask whether later insurgencies became entangled with the drug economy, the honest answer is also cold. That belongs to a later chapter, decades after April 9th, when prolonged conflict collides with the coca economy and war learns to finance itself. It is not accurate to blame the Bogotazo for that mutation. It is accurate to say that long wars eventually find economies and economies eventually change what a war is. So when Colombians ask who killed Gaitán, they are not only asking for a name, they are asking for absolution. Tell us it was one man so we don't have to believe the system was rotten. Tell us it was foreigners so we don't have to face our own elites. Tell us it was passion so we don't have to face ideology. Tell us it was ideology so we don't have to face chaos. Every answer offers comfort, and every answer carries its own terror. We end where we began, back on Carrera Séptima, with the sound that still divides the air in Colombia's memory. 3 shots, a body falling, a crowd screaming and a suspect dragged into silence. If Juan Roa Sierra had lived, if he had stood in a courtroom under oath, forced to name motives and accomplices if there were any, would Colombia's history feel less haunted? Or was the country already standing at the edge, waiting for one spark to ignite everything that had been accumulating for years? Listen closely, under the myths, under the accusations, under the Cold War labels, under the whispers of passion, and you can still hear the real horror of April 9th. Not only was a man killed, but a nation was denied the chance to know why in a way that could finally end the argument. Colombia did not just lose Gaitán that day, Colombia lost the possibility of closure. And in a country built on unfinished grief becomes history. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.